Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. US President Donald Trump has announced plans to impose tariffs on steel and aluminium imports from the European Union, prompting potential retaliatory measures by the bloc. With the US and EU being major trading partners, this move will have far-reaching implications. What could this mean for the global economy, and how might the EU respond? Well, to lay this out for us, we're joined by Tomasz Włostowski. He's a managing partner, EU Strategies. Mr. Włostowski, welcome to TVP World, and thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
Good morning to you, sir. So, look, this is no surprise, is it? I mean, Donald Trump has been saying this since well before he was elected. How did the EU prepare for this outcome or eventuality?
Well, the EU's been discussing Trump's, proposed tariffs for quite a while already. As you've mentioned already, this is no surprise. Trump's been very clear about his intentions throughout the campaign. After he assumed office, on the first day of his inauguration, he, instructed all of his sort of future cabinet members to prepare a series of reports that would allow him to investigate the various, imbalance in the United States trade with various partners to prepare these reports. These reports are due on the 1st of April. But as we've also seen, he's not waiting for those reports, right? He fired away last week with first threat of tariffs against Mexico, Canada, and China. Those against China went into effect. He's talked about tariffs on steel, and he's talked about tariffs in particular against the European Union. So what happened is not a surprise. The European leaders have been discussing this for quite a while now. They've just discussed it at the informal leaders retreat Monday last week. They've discussed it at sort of the Trade Council. They're discussing it even today in the European Parliament. So the European Union's been quite it had an advance basically notice of what's happening, and they've had time to discuss.
Understood. Okay, so discussions have been going on for a while now. What are the outcomes thus far?
Well, I think there's a couple of issues. So first of all, I think the European Union, the European Commission has already identified sort of the main avenues, procedural avenues, and the way that you might respond. So that's number one. We also sort of discussed the possible retaliation sort of tactics. That's number two. They've also sort of built up the political support for it. So that's number three, and that's what the informal leaders retreat and the Trade Council last week were all about, building the political support. There are different ways we can proceed. One is tariffs on sort of expose the U.S. states. As we know, there are midterm elections coming in 2 years. A number of Republican states have elections to the Senate. There's a whole election to the House. So there are a number of states that are exposed. So the plan is to hit with tariffs the exports of those states to the European Union. That's number one. There's also sort of a discussion over the use of a new instrument that the EU has adopted, the anti-coercion instrument, which allows Europe to, restrict trade in various different areas. There have been discussion over attacking sort of Elon Musk and the social platforms. That's number three. So there's quite a wide array of measures that the EU can take.
Understood. But the EU is actually exporting more to the US than the other way around, are they not? And so aren't they risking that relationship, perhaps unnecessarily, by retaliating? Are there any other ways?
Well, I mean, are there other ways? Yeah, of course there are other ways. And I think the European leaders have been very clear that what they intend to do is engage constructively, engage very early on. But I think there's also a sort of an indication that tariffs are coming whatever happens. I mean, I think there is a sentiment that President Trump has decided to fire away very early on without sort of looking at sort of the facts and without trying to resolve it before tariffs happen. And one of the sort of major factors that European leaders believe Trump will look at is how Europe responds. This was one of the lessons learned from Canada and Mexico. There was an executive order sort of threatening imposition of tariffs. Both Mexico and Canada threatened to retaliate immediately, and those tariffs were postponed. So I think one of the lessons that the European leaders took from it, that a quick retaliation is instrumental in delaying the tariffs further on.
Well, in Canada and Mexico, his demand was based on securing the border between those countries and the US, at which both Canada and Mexico have taken concrete action on. Does that demonstrate a transactional approach, which is, of course, what we all expect from Trump? And is there a transaction that could be developed between the European Union and the US to either bring down the rate of tariffs or suspend them?
Well, absolutely. So, but let's take a step back. The tariffs on Canada and Mexico were threatened based on sort of national security and fentanyl and opioid contraband. But the reason for that is because President Trump needed a clear statutory authority to unilaterally impose tariffs. And the easiest thing for the president to do when the president wants to sort of act alone without the Congress is to invoke a national security. So that's probably one of the reasons why he did that. As I've mentioned already, he's waiting for the reports from his U.S. trade representative, from the Commerce Secretary, from the Treasury Secretary. Once he has those reports, he has more trade authority. Right now, his main authority is national security. That's why he's invoking national security, and he's going to be invoking national security going forward. Now, to answer your question about negotiations, of course, the way to out of this is through negotiations. I think Europe has already hinted possible sort of space for compromise. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has sort of come out very early on saying, look, one of the things we can definitely increase imports from the United States is LNG. We're trying to replace Russian gas with sort of non-Russian gas. America is a great exporter of LNG. We're happy to buy more of that. That's number one. Number two, I think it's clear Europe needs to increase its defense spending. Therefore, obviously, major sort of procurement activities will be happening on the European continent in terms of defense. And of course, America is a great sort of manufacturer and supplier of defense products. That's number two. And I think there will be much more sort of areas in which Europe can increase American imports.
Understood. Now, I mean, it is, of course, an enormous amount of trade between the two, the EU and the US. There will, of course, be ripples worldwide economically. What do you expect those ripples to be? How will they manifest?
Well, I think one of the main sort of casualty of if I may use that word, of President Trump is that we can manage our expectations. We can't. We really don't know how he will act, what he will do. You know, the situation will be changing really quickly. So that's number one, and that's of course very bad for trade and for supply chains. You know, businesses, they need predictability. They need to know where they will be sourcing in a few months from now, in a year from now. And it's basically impossible to prepare right now because you don't really know how sort of the relative competitive advantage of various supply sources will develop, right? Because if you're a business, you have sort of long supply chains. You need to know whether, importing from China is going to be cheaper than importing from Europe, for example, or from South America. And it's impossible to determine that because you don't know how those tariffs will come out. So that's number one. Go on.
Well, I mean, what we do know is that the tariffs are focused on steel and aluminium. Should Europe be looking for alternative markets for those goods?
Well, I think Europe believes that. Well, number one is Europe has quite a significant sort of steel market for themselves. That's number one. Of course, we need to look for export markets, but I think there's a greater concern. It's not only about the bilateral trade, but it's about how sort of U.S. tariffs will affect global trade. So basically, once U.S. Because let's keep in mind, this is just sort of a first wave of tariffs. President Trump has also talked about specifically targeting the European Union with tariffs. That's number two. And he's also talked about sort of this retaliatory tariff, against the whole world, trying to even up the tariffs that the U.S. businesses are paying abroad, right? So this steel and aluminum tariff is not really an exception. It's not really the only one that's happening. So Europe needs to sort of develop a global, comprehensive strategy on how to deal with this.
Understood. Now, what does this mean in terms of European development per se, in terms of investment in manufacturing, in supply chains, and so on? Do we anticipate an uptick in that, with European countries investing more in these areas, with an expansion of exports both within the EU and to other markets?
Well, I mean, there are a couple of components to this, right? The first one, I think, about investments. Number one is, I think, Trump's general theory of tariffs is sort of import substitution, right? So he believes that if you impose tariffs, then foreign businesses will come to United States to invest there to circumvent the tariffs. So the first, and he might be right on that sort of in the long term about some key businesses that decide, okay, look, the tariff threat in the United States is too complicated, it's too too damaging to us. Let's just set up a production facility in the United States to circumvent the tariffs. That, of course, can be done, but that takes a long, long time to develop. So that's not going to happen in the short term. Now, for European investment, I think, yes, you're absolutely correct that European leaders and the European Commission in particular will try to sort of put a contrast between the United States and Europe and say, look, United States is completely sort of unpredictable in terms of its trade policy, its tariff policy. Europe is predictable. We know what we're doing. We have a set of regulations. Nothing's going to be changing here in a major way on the tariff policy. However, keep in mind that Europe is in the midst of a discussion about sort of changing its own sort of climate policy and how stringent the climate regulations are and whether they need to be lessened or at least simplified to some degree. So there's change afoot in Europe as well.
Understood. Well, Mr. Włostowski, thank you very much indeed for sharing your analysis with our audience. Have a good day, sir, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye. Thanks. And that's all from us in this episode of World Talks. Goodbye for now.